Hello and welcome. I'm Glenn Macy, the University Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Bryant University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, The Challenges Ahead After what we all know was a historic election. First, before I begin, I'd like to thank a few people. As you know, there are those folks behind the scenes making it all happen, and it's important to thank them, as this is the fourth in an incredible series, and in some ways, it's the seventh one we've done since the spring and the pandemic hit Rhode Island and the United States. Truly, our IT team and the AV team, thank you for what you've done at Bryant University. Again, risen to the occasion and made sure these have been gone off seamlessly, and we thank you tremendously to Vice President Licurdo and his staff and the AV team, completely, Jeff Chandler and all. Cecilia Cooper has been just tremendous. Most of you know her and many of you know her. She has been tremendous with organizing these behind the scenes, and she and Elizabeth O'Neill have been tremendous in getting communications out and working with our faculty and staff and others and guests to make these panels worthwhile. And I thank them so much as their provost. And it goes without saying, the brainchild for this series, started last March, is Dr. Eddie Tibaldi. He really has put together an excellent, timely, and intellectually stimulating series that I will never forget, and has really raised the prominence of Bryant University and showcased the incredible faculty that we have here and the many others that come as guests and visitors to Bryant to showcase Bryant University. So I thank you, Eddie, for all you've done being the brainchild of this series. This is the final panel, Paths to Recovery, Strategies for Getting Back to Work and to a Better Future. The first three panels offered perspectives, as most of you know, on healthcare, social issues, and then finance. Help us better understand the many complex challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and how we can move forward on that path to recovery to create a much better future for all of us. It's now my honor to welcome today's panelists, distinguished leaders who have graciously agreed to share their time and expertise with us. Many of them you'll have recognized from media and TV already. They are Ross Guttell, my boss and the Bryant University president, a distinguished academic, economist, and an economic development expert. Dr. J. Philip Thompson, New York City's Deputy Mayor for Strategic Initiatives and an expert in urban politics and coalition building. And Dr. Mark Zandi, Moody Analytics Chief Economist, who is nationally respected advisor to many policymakers and an influential source of economic analysis for all of us in myriad ways. The panel will be moderated by Margie O'Brien, who is a 25-year veteran journalist and the director, many of you know here in Rhode Island, of Rhode Island Capital TV. Margie will lead our panelists in an important conversation about the impact of the pandemic on our country's economic and political landscape. Our panelists will provide their unique perspectives on where we go from here to address some of our country's biggest challenges. And I think we all know there are a lot that lay ahead. We are grateful for the continued partnership of Neil and the Rhode Island Foundation, as they have been with us since our successful pandemic economics series began last spring. I also want to recognize our sponsors, without whom we couldn't do this sort of great offering and programming. Citizens Bank and Fidelity Investments, for their generous support of these panels, which are all free and are all open to the public. And now, please join me in welcoming Margie O'Brien, who will begin what is sure to be an excellent and informative discussion. Margie.
Good morning, and thank you, Provost Somosy. And to everyone who's joining us, welcome. This has been such a great, fantastic series. I've been so honored to be part of it. I have moderated two others, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning. I will say, just even seeing the backgrounds, I do miss being in the beautiful lecture hall at Bryant and seeing people, seeing faces, shaking hands. I know we're going to get back to that, but for right now, this is a great format. So let's begin. Just a couple of notes right ahead. We're going to have our panelists talk about the perspective on the economic and political landscape, the challenges and opportunities, most importantly, on moving ahead, all eyes on 2021. But later in the program, there will be an opportunity for questions from our people that are joining us today. So we want you to put those questions in the Q&A box right on the bottom. Now, typically, if you're on a Zoom meeting, you'd put that in the chat. But for today, we're asking you to put your questions anytime they come to you during the talk, write down in the question and answer box. We'll have our team look at these, and then of course we'll be able to ask them to our distinguished panelists later in the broadcast. So we're going to start with the students out there who are joining us. We want to hear from you. So please feel free to ask your questions. And this is going to be part one, economic and political landscape. And I asked the panelists to keep your answers to about 5 minutes long so we can keep this conversation going. Question one, we're going to start with Philip Thompson. As a political scientist and a top leader of one of the largest and most diverse, and many would say, except for your baseball team, one of the best cities in the country, I wanted to ask you, what do you anticipate the economy looking like over the next year, the next 3 to 5 years? And a little part B on this, what impact will the economy have on the politics in New York City and across the country?
So thank you. New York has 2 baseball teams, professional baseball teams. So I assume you're talking about the Mets. But in what happens in the next year in the city, of course, depends, number one, on COVID and how much more damage the pandemic is likely to wreak in New York. And right now, we are serving 1 million meals a day because we have a lot of hungry families. We have 600 soup kitchens operating every day. We have 1 million people who've lost jobs. And we are $9 billion underwater in our budget because we haven't received federal relief to pay for all of the extraordinary things we're having to do in terms of feeding people, housing people, putting folks in hotels who can't afford, who don't have space in their own homes for isolation, and on and on. And so if Georgia elects 2 Democratic senators, we think we're more likely to get a robust relief package from Congress. If that doesn't happen, we're likely to get far less help. And that's going to have a big economic impact in New York. That will really affect what happens in the next year. Many of our small businesses are just hanging on by a thread. We've already lost a lot of small businesses. They can't pay their rent. And many will go under in the next few months unless there is relief. And also unless the relief is really targeted in the neighborhoods where it's most needed. And we can talk about the PPP program, that the past relief package, and how a lot of the resources did not go where they were most needed. So beyond the next year, well, let me say this, New York will rebound. The question is how quickly. And if we get relief, it will happen far more quickly. The next 3 to 5 years, I think there's a lot of promise. The city, but it depends on public policy and public policies. And the city has tremendous infrastructure needs. We need a new tunnel, rail tunnel coming from New Jersey for transit. That's been stuck in Congress. We have 900,000 buildings that need to be retrofitted for energy efficiency. And it's something we're moving on bit by bit, but it's something Biden has said he's really committed to. New York City has 520 miles of saltwater coastline. We have more coastline than the major cities on the West Coast and the East Coast combined. So, and the sea levels are rising. And so we have to invest mightily in infrastructure in order to cope with this change that's happening to our climate. And that means jobs for a generation of people. The issue, though, is it also requires massive investment in education and training of our young people so that they're ready to take on these jobs and take on these challenges. We're an aging city. 1 in 5 New Yorkers within 10 years will be retired, senior citizens. We know our healthcare needs are going to expand dramatically. Once again, education and training. Will New York young people in our public schools get those healthcare jobs? Will they be the providers, or will we have to import from elsewhere around the world and country in order to fill those jobs? And lastly, technology is already big in New York City, and it will become far bigger. We need to invest a lot more in skills training, especially in critical thinking. That is something robots and artificial intelligence are not good at. AI is not very I. You still need people to deal with novel situations. You still need people who have dexterity, manual and mental dexterity, but that requires training people on how to think critically and creatively. And that needs to start from the earliest grades right through college and beyond. So I would say our future hinges a lot on education and training and preparing our young people in New York to succeed in a rapidly changing economy.
Thank you, Phil. And just heartbreaking to hear that there's more than 600 food pantries serving more than 1 million people. But we've seen it. We've seen it on the news where the long lines of cars for people who are trying to get help for their families. Hopefully there will be relief in sight. Moving on to Mark Zandi. Mark, in your position as chief economist for Moody's Analytics, you have access to global economic data and are a top advisor to the policies. Talk a little bit about what you expect over the next year, both in our country and globally.
Well, thanks, Margie. I want to thank you and Ross and Bryant University for the opportunity to address the group. So thank you. I think the next 3 to 4 months will be tough for the U.S. economy and much of the global economy. The pandemic is raging. Infections, hospitalizations, deaths are rising. And it's not hard to connect the dots between the pandemic and the economy. Phil did a pretty good job of that from the perspective of New York, but this is a problem that's now across the country. So that's going to do a lot of damage, and it already is showing up in the data. Employment, which had been coming back from the initial shock of the pandemic earlier in the year, looks to be stalling out, and it's largely because businesses have to pull back. Restaurants, retail, recreational activities, those industries that are severely disrupted by the pandemic. And I wouldn't be surprised if we suffer some job loss and an increase in unemployment again here in the next few months. Unemployment nationwide is 6.7%, which is high. You know, it's about the peak unemployment rate in the typical recession since World War II. So it's very high, and it'll probably go higher over the next few months. A lot does depend in the next few months, next year, next couple of years, on what lawmakers decide to do or not do here. There's been a lot of Congress and the Trump administration did a good job early on in the pandemic of providing support to the economy. The well-known CARES Act, very large $2.5 trillion package of relief, and that went a long way to helping hard-pressed households in the early parts of the pandemic. But that is now fading away and will all expire by the end of the year. There's expanded unemployment insurance that'll expire at the end of the year. There's a moratorium on rental evictions that is slated to expire at the end of the year. Student loan borrowers have had a moratorium on payments that'll expire at the end of January now. Businesses have tax credits to retain employees. That'll expire at the end of the year. So very shortly here, we're going to be on our own without any additional support. And if lawmakers can't get it together, sign another piece of legislation to provide support, then I think it's going to be a very difficult few months. And I think the odds that the economy will go back into recession, as you know, it suffered a very severe recession back earlier in the year. It's been expanding since, but it'll go back into recession. And this period will go down in history as a so-called double dip recession. If lawmakers are able to get it together here in the next few days, and if not, then on the other side of Vice President Biden's inauguration, then it's going to be a tough few months, but it should pick up pretty quickly as we move into the spring, and we'll avoid an outright downturn. I am more optimistic about prospects by this time next year. I do think, obviously there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about the vaccines that are now being distributed. I think adoption rates will be pretty good. My sense is that by this time next year, given the inoculations, given the fact that many people have suffered the infections, that we'll have something close to herd immunity. And at that point, the economy will kick into a higher gear. There's a lot of pent-up demand, as you can imagine, for things we've not been doing. High-income households that are navigating through this pretty well have been saving. They've not been traveling. They've been not going to restaurants. They've not gone to ball games. They haven't seen the Mets play in person. So, they'll want to do all of those things and then some, and that'll support a lot of economic growth. So we have to get from here to there, and we need a little bit of help doing it. The final thing I'll say is, I agree with Phil. Getting back to something we would consider to be normal, we're all comfortable about the way the world's operating. People are back working. We're close to full employment. How fast we do that does depend, again, on Washington and what lawmakers decide to do on the other side of the pandemic. If we can't get any additional legislation to provide additional support to the economy, infrastructure, education, housing, healthcare, all these issues, then it's going to take a while to get back to something we feel good about, at least several years. If lawmakers can figure out a way to come to terms and provide funds for those kinds of things, I think the economy can get back to full employment a lot more quickly. So a lot does depend on how the political environment unfolds here over the next few weeks, next few months, and what lawmakers decide to do or not do. But just to summarize, the next few months are going to be tough. It's going to be difficult. By this time next year, I'm optimistic we're going to feel a lot better about things, and in the longer run, a lot does depend on what our elected officials decide to do or not do.
Oh, troubling times for sure. And President Gattel, you heard from both Mark and Phil that there is optimism for 21. So building on this analysis and the projections, will you help us understand the economic and political landscape, both as an economist and a leader, a college president? What is the future economic and political policies depending on, and what do they mean for higher education?
Good enough. First I want to start off by thanking you, Margie, for moderating and hosting this event, and Phil and Mark for joining this discussion. The intersection of politics and economics is critical as we want to see our way out of this pandemic and then into an economic recovery. I'm going to focus, at least first of all, from my perspective, pretty new 6 months in as president of Bryant University, a college leader, and focus on that perspective. And that perspective is recognizing, like what Phil highlighted, that in New York City and other cities and rural areas also across the country, there is much concerns. There's a lot of challenges out there. There's a lot of people who have been displaced by the pandemic and in the economy, and their needs have to be addressed. And also the context that Mark presented, that given the state of the pandemic really drives the economy right now. And that's towards what I'm hearing from Mark, we just heard, is a double dip recession. So more like a W-shaped, reaction to the pandemic. And that's the context that, we're trying to help our students navigate this difficult times for our nation and for this world. From both an economic and political context is going to be challenging, very challenging for our students. For both the economic and political context, higher ed has to be prepared to be responsive in a more timely way than it probably has historically to the top concerns of our students and to larger society. Higher ed, you read about it every day. I think the Wall Street Journal has at least one article about it every day about scrutinizing higher education. And some of it is, justified, scrutinized about its high cost and questioning the value, particularly of the expense of high cost a four-year degree. There seems to be a lot of cynicism and at the same time, high expectations for higher ed. And I believe colleges and universities will have to prove that we're really worth the cost and the time investment. Economically, higher ed, and we're focused on this at Bryant University, we have to ensure that our students are well prepared to do well in the increasingly complex and challenging world, and in particular in the economy that is experiencing accelerated change and significant employment displacement. At Bryant, we have a strong track record preparing our graduates to be successful in a changing economy and world, so preparing them with skills, with competencies that carry over through different economic changes and challenges such as we're experiencing now. Politically, we have to make sure to provide an environment on our campuses for constructive and civil conversations about a range of issues, and have conversations that are increasingly difficult. And in these conversations, be respectful of different opinions and perspectives. Sort of the opposite of what much of social media has turned into. We have to be that place where there could be these difficult conversations and respectful conversations. We have to increasingly work to make sure that we have supportive environment for students of increasingly diverse backgrounds and perspectives to succeed. We are focusing our efforts at Bryant on being a strong, nurturing community for all our students. Our students, our young people, will need a lot of help recovering from this pandemic and from this economic downturn. And we want to support a full range of diverse students. And our university is increasingly diverse and better for being an increasingly diverse institution. Finally, as a university, we will want to contribute to broader learning and bridge building in the larger community to help overcome larger societal divides across our campus. This is a role we can in higher education should play. We have to look beyond just our own students and our own campuses and think about the role we could play, particularly with regards to help overcome some of the increased polarization that we have both politically and economically in our nation. So that's the perspective from higher ed, focused on that. But really a lot of the main challenges coming out of this pandemic and in the economy will fall on our younger and most vulnerable populations.
Thank you, President Cattell, and Mark and Phil. Great first part, some really good answers. It was interesting. We already are getting some questions, and some have already been answered, but others we are going to save for the end so we can address these. But again, for the audience, if you have any questions, we encourage you to type them into the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end of the program. So moving on to part 2, economic growth outlook and opportunities. Looking at the silver linings out there. Mark, I'd like to start with you. From the broader national economic perspective and narrowing the scope to New England and specifically Rhode Island, what are some of the growth prospects overall? How does that break down by industry and the impact on employment here?
Well, there are some obvious growth engines. Technology is a powerful source of growth and for job creation. The technology industry broadly, I'm painting with a broad brush, has navigated the pandemic well. In fact, benefited in many respects from the pandemic. Online activity has surged. People have had no choice, and tech companies, retailers that can take advantage of that have benefited enormously. I mean, Amazon is hiring hundreds of thousands of people because of the success they've had in the pandemic. I think that is an area where we as a nation have a comparative advantage, and that'll continue to be the case. And of course, that requires highly skilled and educated people, and you can't get a good tech job unless you're educated in a place like Bryant University. So that's a key source of growth. And of course, New England and Rhode Island has a very highly educated workforce, and it just key to growth and key to being able to take advantage of the fast growth in the tech sector. Various forms of professional services, everything from law and accounting to advertising to management consulting. My business, I have I'm part of Moody's Analytics, but what I do within Moody's is I do economic consulting. I have a couple hundred economists that work for me all over the world, and we have again as a nation a comparative advantage there, and moreover requires highly skilled and highly educated workers. Financial services, healthcare services, the aging of the population. That's something that the economy's been impacted by now for the past 10, 15 years. The baby boom generation, my generation, is a large cohort, still the largest, I believe. Millennials may surpass it relatively soon, but it's a very large cohort. We're now in our 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we're consuming a lot of healthcare. We'll do so going forward, and a lot of financial services and other professional services. And again, that requires, if you want a job in those industries, that requires a high level of educational attainment and skill. So that just goes right to the strength of the New England economy and the Rhode Island economy. It's your people. That's your main resource. And they're talented, highly educated, and innovative, and they're going to get jobs in those industries that are going to lead the way in the future.
So Mark, for the people who are joining us today that might be tweaking and tuning their resumes, not to put you on the spot, but are there any other companies that you see besides Amazon and perhaps Zoom that have had these breakthrough moments because of the pandemic?
Yeah, there are plenty. Just take a look at all the IPOs that are happening. Dashdoor today. I mean, who would have figured? I mean, Planeteer, that's the defense software contractor. Bit controversial, but gives you a pretty good sense of, that's cyber, that's security, cybersecurity. Another good example, Uber. We know Airbnb. Booming because of the pandemic. All you have to do is take a look, and there's just a rush of IPOs. Just take a look at the list there of the companies that are going public, and that'll give you a pretty good sense of, what's happening. And a lot of that's just being driven by, they would have done well, pandemic or no pandemic. I mean, they've got, they're the best in the world at what they do. And there's a lot of demand for what they do, but the pandemic certainly has raised their stature and improved their business to a significant degree, and it benefited enormously from that. And then there's the big guys that are creating lots of jobs. I mentioned Amazon, but they're obvious. Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Netflix. I mean, they're just running away with things because of how well things are going. So. Yeah, if you want to really know where the action is, where the jobs are going to be, I Google initial public offerings, take a look at that list, and I'll give you a pretty good sense of things pretty fast.
All right, great advice, Mark. Moving on to Philip Thompson, through a political lens from the national view right down to local politics, where do you see the opportunities for growth? And what, if anything, is missing right now from the current political environment? And how can our system become better and, of course, more productive?
So I'll start with the middle question. I think there's tremendous anxiety across the country about the future, and that goes for all groups, you know, the working class, Black and Latino families. I think a lot of what has driven Trump, his support, is anxiety. People are really unclear about the future and where will their kids have jobs. Most working families haven't seen their incomes rise in 30 years, in a generation. And it's true, Wall Street has been doing really well, but you know, these families don't have investments in Amazon or other portfolios where they're benefiting from the gains in Wall Street. And there's anger, resentment, and fear that's driving a lot of our politics right now. One of the things I think is really important is to, as Ross mentioned earlier, to create space for dialogue that's not, you know, about what's affecting people's lives and their families and their fears, and dialogue across the political spectrum, across racial groups, across communities. And that is missing from our political landscape. We do not invest in civic engagement or popular education about the profound changes that are shaping our country and the world. And I mentioned climate change before, technology is been mentioned, but also demographic change. A majority of Americans in a short while, in coming decades, will be non-white. They'll be Black and brown predominantly. If these kids are not being educated, as Mark was saying, well, you know, you need a good education, you need good training to get the good jobs in tech. Well, in New York, we have a lot of Black and brown families that don't have internet access. And now they're having to school remotely, but there's no internet access where they live because the internet companies couldn't make a profit providing access in their neighborhood. So it doesn't exist. And government, we have to step in and do that. We have a lot of challenges like that. So I think the last thing I would say about this is I spent 19 years at MIT, and Mark was saying New England has a lot of talented workers. That's true, but I gotta tell you, they're not Black and brown kids who are being trained to do this work. And it's not because the kids aren't smart. I have a young friend who was one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter, like in the beginning with Trayvon Martin in Florida. And he was one of the leaders this past year in the national Black Lives Matter movement. My wife and I encouraged him to go to business school. He went at Duke on a correspondence class a couple years ago. He just got hired at SpaceX, and he is going to be leading an effort to use satellites to provide internet access in rural America, but also everywhere in the world. This kid is bright, but there are so many kids, young people just like him, who do not have an opportunity in our country right now because our educational system is failing and we're not investing in it. And it's failing too many kids. One of the profound changes that I will just mention, just to give an example, productivity and growth is more and more shaped by software and machines, which in turn is largely a consequence of public investment in education and research. Those skills and those talents really come primarily from public investment in education and research. Wages, I said before, we need to train young people in critical thinking starting in preschool. Wages are largely more and more, they're not determined by actual productivity on an individual level. They're determined by politics and social convention. So we call daycare workers unskilled workers. They get paid minimum wage in New York and in most cities. We call plumbers and carpenters skilled laborers. That has nothing to do with the actual skill. Anyone who's raised young children knows if you want to really raise young children well and impute in them a love of learning and curiosity and critical thinking and social emotional skills and how to work in team, all of that requires a lot of skill. Why do we pay minimum wage to mostly women who do this work, but we call the men carpenters skilled workers? That is pure prejudice, coming from a history where women's work was devalued. In fact, it was supposed to be done for free, and men were the breadwinners. We have to change fundamentally how we think about work. And what is a good lecture worth for a professor or for a high school teacher? How do you put a price on that? You don't get rewarded for doing a dynamite lecture versus a mediocre lecture. We don't even have a way of measuring it. So we have to rethink how we compensate people and also invest in the things that are going to make a difference, like teaching, and learn how to better evaluate teaching. The highest level of productivity I've seen at MIT comes from collaboration. Not, I'm going to keep my ideas a secret so I can get a personal patent and become a millionaire myself. That slows everything down. The stuff that is really dynamic is when people share ideas, debate. There's a culture that encourages that, but we don't yet know how to compensate people in collaborative settings or for sharing ideas. And that to me is a challenge for the accounting departments of our universities. How do we reform our patent laws and accounting techniques to encourage what is most productive in the economy and in society, which is more and more is about collaboration, sharing, knowledge and spread and infusion, not our traditional model from the old economy of keep everything to myself, and entrepreneurship, individual success is the way in which everything moves and productivity increases most rapidly. That's just one of the challenges, like climate change and other things that I think we're not having conversations about.
Philip, important words there. And I think that this topic of just compensation could be a topic for another whole series. So we'll work on that for next year. This next question really geared towards some of the students in our audience today for President Gattel. What are the opportunities for economic growth from your perspective? What should colleges be doing to prepare students for the post-pandemic labor market? And selfishly, I'm going to take notes on this because I have a college student who will be looking for unemployment this summer. You're muted.
I should know how to do this already since so many meetings have been in Zoom, but sometimes I'm so anxious to start talking, I forget to unmute. But I'm going to, in my reply, I'm going to try to incorporate some really of the important and insightful comments that Phil and Mark made. Phil, the SpaceX story of, former leader or currently involved in Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's the power of education. That's the power. Not only that individual has done well for themselves professionally and takes advantage of their skills and potential, but that individual's innovativeness, entrepreneurship, and skills are then provided back to enhance opportunities for others through what SpaceX is doing on internet access to the broader community. That's really the power of education, and we want students to be inspired by that and to build the types of skills, competencies that both Mark and Phil talked about. So, I believe, as Mark indicated, that we could expect the pandemic to impact different sectors of the economy differently. What we do know is that the pandemic has accelerated changes in virtually all industries. It sort of put the economy on rapid speed, and it's accelerated change that Mark and other economists, I think, could fairly say you expected this to take place, the movement towards Amazon taking over commerce and other trends, just happened faster than we might have expected because of the pandemic. And it's also changed in an accelerated fashion, the competencies and skill sets that are in highest demand in the labor market. At Bryant, we work with real-time labor market data and in our work on student placement, because we want to see what employers are asking for and get detailed information about those job postings and what skill sets are required. And what we're seeing in our largest employers of Bryant graduates, they are hiring in this economy. They are hiring in this economy about the same rates as they were hiring last year at this time. And this is because our top employers of our Bryant graduates are Fidelity, Citizens Bank, PwC, accounting firm, Amica Insurance, and CVS. And our students, our strongest and largest programs are in finance, accounting, insurance, and healthcare related industries, which are, as Mark described, doing relatively well in the economy. And we are focused on the skills training that employers are increasingly asking for. So when you drill down on those skills that our Bryant employers are demanding through their job postings, it includes the hard skills that Mark talked about. And that's the hard skills that are going to be necessary in an increased digitalized and data intensive and technology driven economy. So it's those skills plus the hard financial skills. Those IPO companies, they have a lot of tech skills, they have a lot of marketing skills, but you got to build the case for an IPO, and you have to have the hard finance skills to put together a business plan that you could convince investors to invest in and to go public. But the employers are increasingly demanding a set of common skills that really Phil highlighted. Those common skills, the foundation of that is critical thinking. Critical thinking across a broader landscape than just the finance or the accounting. Critical thinking across the multi factors that really affect a business performance or anything you do in decision making. And that you have to be an effective communicator and to work in teams effectively. And a lot of those skills we build upon at Bryant in experiential education and internships and in design thinking projects for our students, to have them be critical thinkers and innovative and get that training and experience. So when they enter the labor market, they're well prepared and they have these experiences to draw upon. But a lot of our students come with that foundation on critical thinking and communications that they've developed earlier on. And Phil talks about that's lacking sometimes in K through 12 education. So those common skills, those critical thinking and related skills are really critical. The reality also, and I think we need to focus on this with our students here at Bryant, is where they work is going to be increasingly less important. We have a large Fidelity location right across our street. The story here when at Bryant, you went from graduation, you walked across Route 7 and you started your job at Fidelity. And now, our graduates are going to be starting jobs at Fidelities, but they're going to be going back home in their cars and working in their home office and working from there more often than across the street from Bryant at Fidelity. So we have to prepare our students to be effective in the virtual workplace. And that's emerging now, and it's an important area for our students to be really prepared for. And the good news about going remote last March and doing high flex education at this point is our students are getting really good at virtual communications, virtual learning, and a lot of them are taking on internships and initial jobs where they're working virtually in the employer space. So I think the recent college graduates that are able to continue their education, and then the economy will hit that W, it will be on the start of the second recovery from the second recession, will be well positioned for the labor market if they're placing in those industries, which Mark and I mentioned, and they have the hard and common skills that we talked about. So it takes a lot of focus, a lot of concentration, but I think the future could look bright if we prepare our workforce across the full range, the broad economy and the broad demographic groups for changes in the economy that the US economy long-term is relatively well positioned to excel in, as evidenced by these IPOs that are hitting the street now and doing very well.
President Gattel, just great information there. And I think you're right that these students today are mastering this virtual landscape. But I wanted to ask the final question to both Phil and Mark. Can you add to this? What should college students be focusing on? How can they make a difference in their lives and others? And what will their greatest challenges be, the greatest opportunities? What can they do now to get the ball rolling in a positive way for the future? Feel free to jump in.
I'll start. I have 3 boys now, 2 biological and 1 we adopted. And what I like to say is most jobs of the future haven't been invented yet. And the businesses that are going to be successful, we don't know their names yet. And what's, with technology, it's going to be more like apps and really that boils down to ideas. So I have a younger cousin, he's not young anymore, who grew up in West Philadelphia. He's like my younger brother, but he doesn't look like me. He's 6'4", he's slim, and he was an amazing basketball player in high school. And he went to Overbrook High School, which is where Wilt Chamberlain went. He was a basketball star at the high school, but he almost flunked math at Overbrook, which is difficult to do. It is a inner city school with not great math. He almost flunked math. And then he went to college. He went to Westchester University. He was a basketball star. He was in the news all the time. And we thought he had a career in basketball. And I was excited about it because I've always wanted free tickets to NBA games and all of that. But junior year in college, he took a computer science course and he said, Phil, I'm quitting the basketball team. I love computer science. And I was like, what are you talking about? You've never been interested in school. You're an amazing basketball player. You can dunk, like get 3 feet above the rim. I could never dunk in my life. Like, what are you doing? So he, after college, he said, when I watch basketball on TV, they don't show what I see when I'm playing. I'm looking for angles. I'm looking for cuts. They don't show that because the cameras are stationary. So he invented a way of moving a camera on wires, and he built a software system that controls it from a joystick. And that became a company called Skycam, which he sold. Then he built another company to do human resources management in public schools. This is a kid who almost flunked math at Overbrook High School, right? And what he saw was missing on TV on basketball, none of my students at MIT ever would have seen because they can't dunk. They don't play basketball. They didn't know something was wrong with the way that TV was showing basketball, but he did. So everyone, including all of our inner city kids, including all the students at Bryant, you have something to contribute. And you need to really develop that, focus on that, and don't lose confidence. Don't just ask, how am I going to fit in to someone else's dream or someone else's company? Also look inside and say, what do I have to contribute? And really build on that. And that's what he did. And that's what I try and encourage all young people to do.
So Margie, I don't have any particularly wisdom or insight here. I mean, seems, I can just tell you what I think has helped me, and that just you work hard, you be persistent, you find something you love and you keep at it. And hopefully you get a little bit of luck. Luck matters a fair amount. But being persistent helps ensure that if something comes your way, you'll be able to take advantage of it. But the other thing I'd say, I'm not sure I'm as confident in this statement as I would have been 10 years ago, but get as much education as you can, as long as you can. There's no rush if you're able to, I know it's expensive, but The more skills you are able to acquire, accumulate, hone, the better your educational level of educational attainment, the better off you'll be in the long run. So if you can keep on with your education, keep going as long as you can. It'll benefit you in the long run.
Well, staying with the theme of education, we do have some great questions from our audience. The first comes from Chen Zhang. And his question is how the long return period of public education, in parentheses being 10 or more years, can be better rectified within a political system with 4-year terms. Could education be better supplemented by more private investment to overcome such a conflict? And I ask anyone to jump in with the answer.
I think I'm looking forward to hearing Mark and Phil's response, but I think the American education systems with the combination of public institutions and private institutions that are nonprofit but serve their communities and their students, and now some private institutions, including some corporate entities that are increasingly in the education or training space. It's sort of the mix, and that's the American economy. It's kind of the mix of the private sector innovation, the nonprofit sector, which is quite significant, and some hybrids of those two to serve a range of needs and allow for different investments, including public investments, and then also private investments for those who have particular needs or wants. I think this kind of mixed model is effective as long as there's a distribution of educational resources and access that's fair and supports a individual advancement and economic opportunity, but also larger society goods. So what I hear from Mark is that the economy needs more educated workers to have a stronger economy, a more productive, a more resilient economy. And therefore, it's a good use of public investment to do the types of things that Phil's talking about, which is improve public education. And Phil's talking about New York City, but Margie, you're the Rhode Island person here. I'm new to Rhode Island, but Rhode Island could benefit from stronger K-12 education, and the governor and others are working towards that, but that's really, the future starts there. And that should be a combination of public, private, and philanthropic investments in that, because it serves the larger good. We're focused on our students here at Bryant and their success. We're a very small institution relative. We, 3,000 students in larger landscapes. But when our students come here from increasingly diverse backgrounds, we work really, really hard on making sure they're successful. So there's more success stories, just like Phil talks about his 2 stories. And that's what we want, more and more of those success stories. We have a lot of those out of Bryant. We're very fortunate. But we need to create that across a wider landscape.
I mean, one thing I'll say is that, I agree that we need more public education, both at K through 12 level and in higher education. And I think it feels like under the Biden administration, we're going to have a more fulsome debate around how to pay for higher education. Student loans really are not the way to run the railroad. I mean, they just jack up tuitions, and I don't think the kids are any better off. I don't think they're on a bit of a treadmill here, financial treadmill. And there's been discussions about how to reduce the burden of student loans, and also how to pay for higher education for community colleges, historically Black universities and colleges. Just provide more resources to keep people to allow folks with lower incomes and minority groups get more higher levels of educational attainment. I think that's a very fulsome discussion and a very important one, and hopefully we make some progress there. But I don't think I'd count on it. I think that's going to be difficult. A lot depends on the political environment, but that'll be a very difficult thing to do given the environment that we're in. So having said that, I do think it's very important for universities to figure out ways to team up with businesses. And help businesses train the people that those companies need, to be really developing partnerships, joint ventures with companies in their communities to figure out what skills the kids need and what kind of training they need, and then provide it. And the businesses, I think, will then provide funding and resources and computer equipment and other resources necessary to do those kinds of things. And there are some good examples of that across the country, where you see companies teaming up with local universities, and there's a kind of a dollop of public support there too to help facilitate that collaboration. But I think really that's the kind of thing I think universities, particularly smaller universities and colleges, should really be focused on. Otherwise, they're not going to survive. It's not going, given the environment that we're in, very unlikely that they're going to get a lot of help otherwise. And there's a lot of questions about, the quality and the marketability of the skills that kids are getting at universities and colleges. And if you do team up with businesses that, show that, if you go through this program and do these things, high probability of getting a job on the other side of all of that, I think much more likely that those universities and colleges and centers of higher education are going to survive what is certainly going to be a pretty significant shakeout here going forward. So I think totally on board with the idea that we got to put more resources into education, K through 12 and higher education, and completely rethink student lending. That is just not the way to be financing higher education. It's a really bad way of doing it. But I wouldn't count on it. If I were, Ross, I'd be thinking about, how am I going to navigate the next decade without that help?
I would just add, part of my job is overseeing for the City University of New York. And New York City funds the community colleges, the state government funds the senior colleges for the most part. But I will tell you that we created a program that paid, before the pandemic, that paid for subway fare and school books in our community colleges for the most needy students. And graduation rates more than doubled overall, and in some schools tripled, simply because we help students afford to be able to get to school, afford to be able to buy the textbooks that were assigned in class. We are grossly underfunding higher education, grossly. I said I taught at MIT. In computer science, the faculty to student ratio at MIT is about 1:6, 1:7. 1 in 5 Black computer science majors in the United States are in the City University of New York right now, 1 in 5. The faculty to student ratio in computer science in CUNY is 1:70. In some cases, it's 1:120 students. There is just gross disparity, and we're doing everything, including what Mark is talking about, trying to invite in industry, and industry is stepping up, but it is not enough because the need is just so high. And I just think it is profound stupidity in a country where the economy is moving to a knowledge economy that we're not investing in educating our young people. We have 500,000 students in the City University of New York. That is the future of New York, right there. And it's myopia, ignorance. We're going to be left behind. China is graduating 70,000 engineers a year. We're graduating about 6,000 in our country. We're not going to maintain our advantage in technology. It's as simple as that. So I really think this is a crisis point for our country's future. I hope the Biden administration really does take this up in a major way. And, I think your first question is, how is New York City going to do long term? It really depends on this issue.
All right, thanks, Phil. And I hope for our audience member, Jack Wolf, who asked a question about this, that they both touched on some of the aspects that you were looking at. Just a couple more questions, a little probably more brief this time, getting back to unemployment and the economy. Our unemployment rate is close to 7% right now. Why can't companies hire people? Is it because they're competing with the unemployment benefits that some people are already receiving? What are they looking for? What can't they get here?
No, that's not the reason why. I mean, there's actually been a number of good studies based on the experience of the UI, expanded UI, supplemental UI since the pandemic hit. There was a really good piece that came out from the San Francisco Fed just a few weeks ago. And there is no evidence that the supplemental UI, the $600 a week or $300 a week in extra unemployment insurance that was part of the CARES Act, has had a meaningful impact on jobs or unemployment. That's a red herring. That's not the case. The reason why is we are in a pandemic and there are businesses that just can't function. I mean, you can't go to a restaurant. I don't know about Providence, but Philly, where I live, they just shut them down again. You can't go inside and it's cold outside, so you can't eat outside. People aren't flying because they're scared. So the airlines are laying off, and the transportation jobs, retail, small mom. Usually it's a lot of small companies. Generally, they don't have the resources and can't compete. The flip of the Amazon is all those brick and mortar retailers that are getting completely hammered. Any kind of recreational activity, gyms and movie theaters, and a long list of things. They just aren't functioning. I mean, literally aren't functioning, in part because local officials are fearful that if people go there, their hospitals are going to overflow and ICU units, beds aren't going to be available. But also because people are just nervous, and rightfully so, scared. They don't want to get sick, So as long as that's the case, you're going to have at least a 7% unemployment rate. And then on top of that, we still have, because you have so many unemployed people and people under such severe stress. I mean, we've got this bifurcation in the economy. I mean, we talked about those IPOs and tech companies and Amazon, and, they're doing great. But as Phil pointed out, you got lots of folks, tens of millions of Americans that are unemployed, underemployed, hours cut back, pay cuts. It can't make their rent payment. So if they don't get support, they've, at this point, we're 9 months into the pandemic, they've used all of their resources. They came into this with very little in savings anyway. They've borrowed from family and friends. They've tapped out credit cards if they had credit cards. And they're running out of options. And if they get additional help, if they don't get a dollar in, they're not going to be able to spend a dollar. I'll give you one quick statistic to strike this point home. The Bureau of Census has been running a special survey since the pandemic began. Great survey. It's called the Pulse Survey. You can see it on the web, and ask a range of questions to get a better sense of what's going on out there. And they ask unemployed people where are they getting their money for the things that they're spending If you go back early in the pandemic, 2% of the respondents said they were using the SNAP program. That's the food assistance program. In the last week that was available, 11% of people said they were using the SNAP program. That just right there gives you a real good sense of how stressed people are. And if they don't get any help, if lawmakers don't come through, then they're going to have to pull back. So the unemployment is high because we're in a pandemic and we botched it. I mean, we messed it up badly. I mean, you can just see the if we had managed it well, just go take a look at Asia, not just China. Go look at Australia and Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand. They managed the pandemic well. Their economies are back, off and running. They're fully recovered. We did not manage it at all well. We botched it, and we're paying the price for it. So businesses aren't hiring because we're in a pandemic.
So perhaps we're going to learn from our bad lessons. And I just wanted to ask this one last question. And Phil, you had talked about this a little bit earlier. if we get another series of relief funding, what can we do better this time? What did we learn from our past mistakes when the first PPP was rolled out? And this question comes from Laura Gephardt. What changes should be made if we get new relief?
Well, a couple of things I'd mention. One is that last time the Small Business Administration funneled money through big banks to get it out to small businesses. And in a lot of our neighborhoods that have been hardest hit by COVID and hardest hit by job loss, the small businesses don't have accounts at Chase Bank or other big banks. And the banks prioritize the customers who were already, they already had in their system. And these other businesses got very little of that relief. So one of the changes that I know Congress is trying to make is to funnel more money through community development, financial institutions, and build their capacity to actually make the loans, because they know the small businesses in neighborhoods that are most needy, hardest hit, and they are vital in our recovery to build up that sector. So that's one thing. Second thing, we are still in the midst of trying to convince people to take the vaccine. We're still doing testing and tracing, lots of things. One of the things I want to see in the next package is thinking about how we recover and how we recover differently so that we're better off than when the pandemic started. I mentioned earlier that New York has an aging population. Home care workers, and we have hundreds of thousands of them, and that's the fastest growing profession in New York City. They're paid minimum wage and given minimal training. However, they are the front line in taking care of elderly people and keeping them out of hospitals. We pay doctors hundreds of thousands a year to take care of people after they're sick. We pay next to nothing to keep people healthy in the first place, so they don't need to go into the hospital. And that really is the job of the home care worker. And so I would like to see us upgrade services that keep people healthy, that lower the double rate of COVID death in Black and brown communities, because people are already sick from chronic diseases, but there's very little invested in healthy food, exercise, all these other kinds of things that will reduce those dramatic disparities in outcomes, health outcomes. I'd like to see us invest more on the preventative side, and that is really the community health worker, the home care worker, and training them better, incentivizing more people to enter those kinds of fields. Otherwise, we're going to see a rush in hospitals in coming years in New York, not from COVID patients, but from seniors. Because we have an aging population and we're not investing in preventative care.
All right, thank you very much. And to everyone who joined us today, thanks so much for spending time with us this morning, for your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours. To our incredible panelists, Phil Thompson, I don't think we'll ever watch another basketball game without thinking about the angles now of the shots. Mark Zandi, thank you, and stay safe in Philadelphia. And to President Gattel, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this incredible discussion. I hope you and yours, as well as the whole entire Bryant family, has stayed safe and has a wonderful holiday.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to close by thanking our panelists, Mark Zandi and Phil Thompson. I learned a lot. I have to say, I'll leave this session with a lot more to think about because of your commentary. So thank you for taking the time. And Margie, as always, great moderating. We really appreciate what you do in Rhode Island, particularly at this point in time where everybody wants to get information and learn about opportunities to make it through this pandemic and come out on the other side ready to make sure that Rhode Island recovers and is strong in that recovery. I want to thank the audience for joining us. We had really good high participation and throughout this series. And I want to thank our sponsors, Fidelity Investments and Citizens Bank, for their sponsorship of this seminar series throughout the fall and spring. And also Neil Steinberg and the Rhode Island Foundation. They've been exceptional partners for this entire series, providing leadership for the Rhode Island community and working with Bryant since March on this. So, you know, I want to wish all the panelists, Mark, Margie, and Phil, healthy and safe and enjoyable as much as possible holiday season. And thank you for all that you do, your insights that you provide, the time that you've dedicated to this panel. We really appreciate what you've done here for our Bryant community, and we have listeners and participants from more broadly. So thank you to everybody, and please, everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and try to enjoy the holidays.